Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Paul Atherton, an ex-Wall Street advisor and finance whiz, and Tim Whiffen, a millennial with a keen interest in complex problems, talk to experts in many different fields to learn and discover the world's economic and political issues. This is Currency Affairs. I'm here this morning with Paul Atherton and special guest David Olney. Thank you guys for joining us.
Hi, good morning.
Tim. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about China. It's certainly something that's piqued my interest since discussing it initially, Paul.
Yeah, it always piques your interest. It really does pique the interest of the average Australian, because if you look at the Australian economy, it's been really so tied to China, and I can tell you, I certainly know my colleagues in New York, when they think of Australia, they often think of China. They think of it as a proxy for a China play. But we did cover a little bit in a few podcasts ago, and I don't know if we drilled down terribly far, but it's great to have David into the studio to maybe go in a little bit further, because I think it's very important for anybody who's thinking about how they allocate their resources and investment and how Australia's future will drive forward. So, David, let's pitch it straight out to you. What's the China story? What's your thoughts and feedback on our recent podcast?
Perhaps you might want to just give us a bit of your background as well, where your interests lie.
Okay, brief background, trained in political philosophy, but have mainly taught stuff related to security. You can't really understand security unless you understand people in the societies they build. You can't understand societies unless you understand how they create states and how their states interact with the rest of the world. So really started from the small and got to the big. Wondered what a good society would look like, and then thought, well, how do all these different societies end up with these different states, fulfilling different roles in different ways, which is really where China is always fascinating to absolutely everybody. Because it started off, 1949, as a hardcore communist state that could get along with the Soviet Union, and that seemed to be going well for a very short period of time until the Korean War, where the cracks began to show, in the communist world between what would become the two big communist powers. So already from the beginning, you've got the fact, you can't just label China a communist state, because it's not just that. It's a particular kind of communism. And as time goes on after the Korean War, the Soviet Union goes one path, China goes another. And the sort of truly telling moment is when the Berlin Wall comes down and communism in Eastern Europe collapses. Yeah. Interestingly, when Tiananmen Square happens, communism doesn't collapse. They've already got smart. 1979, with Mao being dead, some time to think, they've already transitioned to, we have to make money. We can see that, in the 1950s and 60s, the CIA were suggesting that the Soviet economy would be bigger than the US economy by the mid-1980s.
That's right.
By the mid-1980s, that's of course not the case, because the sheer ineffectiveness of a Soviet system that says, turn up to work, it doesn't matter how good you do, it doesn't matter how bad you do, you get paid exactly the same amount, which is almost worthless. So you totally stifle creativity. Whereas China somehow managed to avoid that initial point of stifling creativity by saying, look, we're going to be in charge, and there's going to be redistribution, and there's going to be state control. But if you play within the rules of getting rich, no one's going to mess with you getting rich. Which means the fundamental starting point for China to understand it in the modern sense post-Tiananmen is, we can crush students and let you get rich and reconcile those two things without blinking or losing sleep, which is an amazing starting point.
I think that's interesting, isn't it? Because it's really the trade the Communist Party's done. So you don't have the sort of democracy that perhaps you might want, or the freedoms that you might be able to get. But we've traded that. We've given you and provided the state structure to give you the wealth, and that trade has worked quite well.
And very importantly, if you look at most countries when they industrialise properly, it's at least 3 generations, maybe as long as 4. So even if we take the Japanese example, where it really kicks in very early 20th century, they had 2 generations, then the destruction of World War II, then 2 generations, then their economic crash. China has put that whole 4 generations of development into 1 generation.
So it's interesting you mentioned the fall of the Berlin Wall and Tiananmen Square, where we're talking of quite a change in history at that period of time, because we're at the back end of the end of the Japanese boom into their bubble as well, which sort of happened at the end of the 80s, 90s. And China really was booming. Like, if you had your radar on, you would have noticed that there was a definite story there. So do you see any similarities? Is there another late 80s coming along now?
Well, I suppose let's unpack the late 80s a bit more first, in that
Sure.
we need to make sense, I think, of why Japan's boom came to a screeching halt.
Yeah.
America was willing to be importer of last resort to get an ally and a production plant against the Communist Union, Soviet Union. No one really loved or cared about Japan. They saw economic value in building it up as a bulwark against communism. So what this meant was Japan was allowed to make a lot of money, but it wasn't able to integrate more broadly into the sort of community of nations. It tried to buy influence, but in the main, its neighbours didn't trust it because of World War II. Most of the world bought its products, but really, in the main, couldn't be influenced by Japan. By having to, in a sense, be successful at making things, but not doing genuine outreach, Japan hit its limits when it couldn't sell any more stuff, at high prices, when its property bubble went, and it didn't have anything to do about it. So instead, what we have with the Chinese is, an equally crazy bubble of making tons of stuff, taking advantage of the US being the importer of last resort, to the point where the Americans no longer like the role, but they've also surrendered the ability to be a manufacturer of much. So we have now a China that is, in some ways, as much of a bubble as Japan was in the late 80s. They've changed almost all the rules about internal investment to make sure they can't have the stock market chaos of 2013 again. If you actually look at how manipulated the Chinese market is internally, it really is under state control and goes up and down in incremental steps based on the number of levers that are in place to stop it going into freefall.
So we have Japan, which was a heavily investment-led economy. Now we've got China, which is a heavily investment-led economy. It's a deeply unbalanced economy. It seems to me very, very similar. Very similar model. In fact, it's the same model. Perhaps you could describe China as a more robust version of what Japan did. But I guess you're suggesting there are some differences along this path.
Yeah.
Maybe China's doing something or a few things different. So maybe you could let us know what your thoughts are.
They have the advantage of not being seen as their region's historical enemy.
Yeah.
Part of the advantage of 200 years of humiliation is no one minded doing business with them. And they were smart enough to go quietly and slowly and steadily into everything. So when they initially started making moves to trade with Africa, buy resources, sell products, it was a tiny scale and no one paid any attention. Now there are millions of Chinese working in Africa. The number of major infrastructure projects is just incredible. If you fly from Australia to Dubai and then Dubai to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, you are most likely to do that flight on a Chinese airline that will be 90% young Chinese guys about to go and work in Africa for a year. You will land in an airport built by the Chinese. You can roll on down the road to UN headquarters in Addis, which was built by the Chinese. So they've done this slow and steady thing of not being loud, but situating themselves as the people who can come in difficult circumstances and build your infrastructure for you, are willing to open a general store, 100 kilometres, beyond the end of the tarmac, selling all Chinese products. Initially with one Chinese person and a few locals, but then later on, more and more Chinese products, more and more Chinese expertise. So this model of quietly going to the difficult places. While the West was busy being comfortable in its own skin, while Japan was busy being comfortable exporting to other OECD nations, the Chinese have been going, well, okay, 2% growth in Uganda means Uganda's got money. It's only at a micro level at the moment, but if we're the first ones there and we're always ready to put the next product in place, and that has been so successful that we now see the One Belt, One Road initiative, which, again, is a 20 to 50 year plan to control low-cost transport, trains and big boats. Now, if we look at it from an oil perspective, rail is the most affordable way to move anything on planet Earth. So if you run rail all the way across China, through Central Asia, through Europe, down through Turkey, they're potentially talking about train lines making it all the way into Africa and right down to Cape Town. The train line through Asia will end in Singapore. So you're preparing for a post-oil economy, one step at a time, in countries where you're the only person who's willing to invest at this level.
Yeah, it's interesting because, from my perspective, the China's outreach to these third world nations, which really most Western countries don't touch, is an extension of their investment binge. So I think most people think of, and it's certainly traditionally, and maybe that's changing now, but most people believe that the Chinese are successful because they have a low cost structure, that they have low employment costs, but it's a cheap capital that drives China. And even in China, they're finding limitations, so it's spilling out into the other regions. And they are certainly going into areas that no one would,
So it's a cheap capital that drives China?
It's cheap capital. Capital that drives China.
Capital, okay, right.
And it's very, people think it's cheap labor. No. It's capital. And then this has spilled out. The question really ultimately is that any investment, that's what I've said before, is it profit? It has to be profitable. If it's not profitable, you don't do it. That would be the question. Will they be able to squeeze out the profit from those investments?
See, I'd change the question. We think about profit because we exist in the bubble of the OECD, where money goes around in a predictable, speculative way. The Chinese are building things and relationships that even after the crash, the things and the relationships will still be in place. And they will be the only people with things in relationship in place to be able to move cheap goods cheaply to the ends of the earth. So their investment with our money that we desperately want to put somewhere is not, in the short term, aimed at making a profit, which is why they just have to keep it upright for as long as they can until the system's there. Because post-crash, they will have the most affordable transport, they will have the most diversified relationships of where to make things all over the world in places that are desperate to be part of the global economy and the transport system to move stuff. So it's either a 50-year plan that means they inherit the remains post a major crash, or, it's just a cataclysm where all this money essentially goes through the shredder because they don't pull off building the networks.
It sounds to me that a large function of their success is the amount of people that they have, because they can afford to send. No, is it not?
No.
Not at all. Because it sounds like, in Australia, I'm not sure that we have the amount of people that we could send to Uganda and then here and there and whatever and expand that way.
Look, you've got to look at the economic model. I mean, it is literally the most unbalanced economy, not just at the moment. The world's global. I mean, it's for a large economy, the amount of share of the of consumption by average consumer, which is their people, is close to the bottom of the list of every single country, so even tiny little countries, and probably the smallest share in history. And that leads to the levels of capital excess, which leads to this unbalanced world that we're in, which leads to these types of large investments. And I think there is a lot of, certainly the very few news articles I've seen on it about China overtaking. And I think David's point is that they're going into areas that, well, no one else is investing. And enabling a level of connectivity with the local governments and the local people that, irrespective of the profit or the dollars that are made out of it, they're going to build those connections. Is that kind of right?
That's David? Basically where they're heading. You got to, again, we'll go back to the population thing because it's really important.
Yeah.
As a consequence of the one-child policy and selective abortion, they won't really admit how many more young males there are than young females in China.
Yeah.
But it's enough in its own right to lead to social upheaval. So part of the advantage of doing this is you have young males who, if they want a chance at a better life economically and the potential to marry, it's not going to be in China. Right. So you have a natural garrison population, a population where you can offer them a job somewhere on planet Earth, where you keep them under close control and they are entirely dependent on the system for their economic success. But in doing so, you also settle a community who will eventually be half of the new community and half of China.
Yeah.
Like always happens, you send young males to the other end of the world and they partner up and have kids. And I'm sure that's not, the Chinese aim to dilute the identity of China. But at the same point, what do you do? Some people estimate it could be as many as 40 million gender difference between young males and young females in China.
Wow.
So what do you do with 40 million young males who have had a better life than their families, but are under the massive pressure to succeed? So we take an Australian example. Next time you drive in a petrol station, if you see a big white or silver truck delivering petrol with no logos on it, it's probably a Sinopec truck, the biggest of the Chinese oil companies, because they deliver more petrol that is, Chinese petrol to service stations in Australia than any company. Most of the trucks that are delivering it are Chinese, and a fair swag of the drivers are Chinese. They're another group of these young males where the opportunity is to go to this new fringe where the capital has been poured in and you put your own people in to make sure that even if the profits are not big, the profits are big enough to do something with your massive population. And the other big population issue is, keep in mind, as a consequence of one child, they've got a rapidly aging population and not enough people paying tax.
Yeah.
So the long-term problem is that you need to send these young people off to make money, because otherwise you are going to have to foot the bills for their parents. So a lot of the young Chinese guys, whether it's driving a truck here in Australia or going and working on an infrastructure project in Africa, mum and dad live in the company flat, home in China, paid for by the son's wages.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just to kind of drag the US into this and Donald Trump. So we, as we were mentioning, the China runs them, sort of these massive surpluses. Not unsurprisingly, the other countries that do that are Japan and Germany. Germany probably even more so. And they push all that capital into the United States, mostly, some into the UK. Now, in theory, the money should be flowing the other way. It should be the United States investing in China. But tell me, what do you think about this sort of dynamic now that we have between China and the States?
They're, in a sense, so economically wedded, they'd be crazy to break it through war. But at the same time, the Americans since 1945 have believed genuinely that they're the global policeman. So they want to be able to go everywhere and do anything and do freedom of navigation within kilometres of ports that China deem critical to global trade. But on the other side, China, who has always been a land power, desperately needs both its new railways to Europe and to Africa and through Asia, and it needs its new ports to be able to move everything, because the one thing of an overbloated mess of an economy is it can't stop. It must maintain its sort of activity as a perpetual motion machine. And, I think this is the illusion that China puts forward to the world, that in perpetual motion is something meaningful. And very little of it is meaningful.
Right.
What it is we've all stopped making stuff. Someone has to. That's not that they were particularly good at it. It's that we chose not to be good at it.
Yeah.
And in terms of the 50-year plan, well, no one else is doing perpetual motion. The rest of the world agonizes about everything. When the G7 get together, they agonize. They have tantrums at each other. They come up with something that within the OECD looks like they did something. But the something doesn't change any fundamentals. Whereas China just keeps pouring money into growing the network, moving young males to work within the network to make sure that the aged population is maintained at home. This is not a system for making profit as we understand it in the West. It's a system for making the system continue to be a system.
So are they a large part to play in us pulling more people out of poverty now, like today, more than ever, even though that's usually kind of associated to like a capitalist function? That's, I mean they are kind of capitalist in the sense that they run their economy, but like, is it actually that kind of low consumption model and then investing in third world countries that's pulling those people out of poverty? Are they the large part in that function? Sorry, it's kind of auxiliary question, but
certainly in Africa, most of Africa by sort of 2000, despite what HIV/AIDS was doing to it, was beginning to find ways to set up sort of microeconomic activity. And when the Chinese come in, they have no interest in assisting that. They come in and they roll out the Chinese general store with all Chinese products, with all Chinese employees.
Okay, so it's very self-centered.
Yeah. So what it provides to the Africans is, if you wanted to start a tiny business, could you now buy a cheaper motorbike for your business? Yes.
Okay.
But are you in a joint venture with the Chinese company? No.
Okay.
So it's an interesting thing where what it means is periodically African populations burn down the Chinese quarter in the capital. I think the last 10 years, 3 Chinese quarters have nearly been burnt down.
Wow.
When the locals just go, hang on, you said you were here to help with our economic growth. All we see is that you import stuff and sell it to us until the point where there's no one else providing, and then you put the prices up. So it's a brilliant, brutal imperial model without ever needing to garrison. And yet what we see now with the ports and the high-speed trains and the military investment, you can't do the level of military investment China's now doing without starting to think like a garrisoning country. Because what do you do with a highly professional military? You've got to do something with it. So their new base in Djibouti is literally, I think, less than 5 kilometres from the main American base in Djibouti. Now, the fact that the Djibouti government agreed to that is hilarious. It indicates they don't care who puts the money in, as long as someone finishes the train line.
I remember, just back to investments.
Sorry.
Yanis Varoufakis, the ex-finance minister of
Greece.
And I like him very much. He's
very, awesome.
Very bright guy. And he was having this conversation, somewhat like we're having now. And he made it very clear. So he was talking, and people say, oh, yes, it's, I forget who he was talking to, economics commentator. Yes, we all know that Greece could do with more money. And he pulled them up very quickly. No. We don't want money. We want investment. And it's a subtle difference, but this difference it's one of those subtle differences make all the difference. Because if you invest in something, in infrastructure, in a port, or something that does something for the local people, that you get benefit to the local economy. If you invest and it's just money pouring into the system, it's actually a massive problem because it creates the deficits that we were talking about.
So it's a bank loan rather than an investment.
It forces a deficit.
Yeah.
Right? That's the simplest way to think about it. And it forces a deficit in sort of the wrong way. If you're going to have a deficit, you do it by increasing your investments. And now we're sitting in a world like awash with cash. And yet, certainly in the West, we're not using it to invest in our infrastructure. And I always say, I travel to city centre here through a series of pathways that I used to go on 30 or 40 years ago, when I was a young lad.
A series of potholes more than roads.
I'd be really interested, David, and maybe this is not, this is sort of orthogonal to China, but why don't we do it? What do you think? What's lacking in the Western system that we refuse to allocate this cheap capital effectively into our own infrastructure?
I think it's fundamentally that at the end of World War II, when anti-communists really founded neoconservatism and neoliberalism, they privileged the free market over people and societies.
Right.
And as a consequence of that privileging, yes, it meant we finally... the mixed economy after World War II in most Western countries delivered better education, better healthcare, better life opportunities than humans had ever had.
Yep.
But in the main, it was poorly managed because doing this was new. And rather than go, okay, we tried something new, the results were awesome, but it's not sustainable, we've got to get more clever. Instead, by 1979 for the Brits, with Margaret Thatcher, 1980 for the Americans with Reagan, 1983 for Australia with Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, instead of getting a gradual refinement, we got the fact that the economy should be privileged over people and society became normal, which means we now care what the market wants to do, not what society needs. And no party can really challenge that now unless they genuinely want to become a new force in politics. So if we were to say now that a massive rebuild of infrastructure is critically important, and let's just have a few examples. Multiple United States counties where there used to be 2 county bridges that were built in the 1930s under the New Deal, now one is shut because it's about to fall down. And the other needs millions of dollars worth of maintenance, and no one's going to pay.
Yeah.
So you conceivably have counties that are going to have no bridges in and out soon.
Yeah.
In the case of Australia, we had our infrastructure boom after World War II, not before. So we've got 15 to 20 years before our bridges fall down. But we're in the same situation. By privileging the market over what society needs, the market will say, why would we pay for a social good?
So the theory that the market follows the social needs is not happening? Is that?
Oh, yeah, yeah. People think it does, or that it's necessary.
Certainly my impression.
History is just replete with examples where that doesn't happen at all. I think, interestingly, again, we're in a world awash. So awash with cash, we got cheap capital. We're not choosing it to invest in the future, invest in some basic infrastructures. We're watching it fall down upon our ears. So the answer is it's political. So the people are not wanting to invest, and often we hear, quite rightly, because it's exactly what's happening. Germany is having the same problem. The infrastructure is falling around their ears, and you wouldn't expect that of an economy like Germany's. And what is the tendency that happens under this scenario, which worries me greatly, by the way, is the wealth gets further and further concentrated in smaller and smaller groups of people. And when there's a concentration of wealth, you get more imbalance. So this sort of horrible feedback loop, because the wealthy spend less of their money than the poor. And when you do that, you get more unbalance, you get more capital, and it's this very bad feedback loop. And I don't know, I like to be optimistic, and generally I am, but I have that sort of little bit of a grey cloud over me. And I was wondering, David, are you a glass half full, or is it half empty?
One of my students once called me a cynical optimist. She was this lovely Romanian who, I wish I could do her accent.
Yeah.
She said, David, you will tell us exactly how bad it is and then try and fix it.
Yeah.
So, I'm the same. I would rather see the positive endpoint and find the way there. But the real difficulty is now that the consequence of neoliberalism and neoconservatism was states sold everything that gave them genuine control over the economy.
Yeah.
So now they either have to renationalise or tax. And we're terrified now of exporting more production to China, so we won't tax companies. Even though if we look honestly at the Chinese model, we go, even if they keep building the network, and the network in the long run, the network of, trade relationships, trains and ports, in 50 years' time means they do run economically the world. There's still going to be a monumental crash before then, in that what they're doing is so destabilising. It's destabilising our speculative economy because we keep speculating on their economy, which we genuinely don't understand. Because economists keep building models of what money should do, what investment should do. And the fascinating difference with the Chinese is whereas we think markets work, they know one thing and one thing only, that if the party does it cleverly enough, they can get the outcome they want. It's total control of society and economy in equal measure, allowing freedom in both where it benefits the party.
It sounds as if you're kind of advocating for that model a little bit.
Oh, I'm in awe of their sophistication, but you couldn't pay me to be a part of it.
Yeah, that's... Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, it relies on a group of people trying to be more clever than the whole world and more clever than the system they've made, and to keep tinkering with it fast enough to keep it moving forward.
You very much are in the Giannis camp. Yeah. He's very, very much very similar. I've got to admit, I'm not that far down that road. By the way, I don't stand in awe of China.
Oh, I'm not in awe of them in a positive way. Just in this is breathtaking that they can actually juggle this many flaming torches and chainsaws.
So if you looked at the Japanese economy in the 70s, it was about 6 or 7% of the global economy, and at its peak, again at that sort of turning point that we were just talking about, with the Berlin Wall coming down, and they were hitting, I think, low 20s.
It was 21 or 22.
Yeah, there you go. And if you were talking to a pessimist, they would say it would take on 25% over the next 10 years, and if you talk to an optimist, it was into the a third of the global economy. And of course, we sit here today, and it's about the same where it was. So it's done a round trip. So just talking to you and listening to you, David, you believe China will not take that round trip? That China will?
Oh no, I think there will be a monumental crash, and they will lose some great proportion. But we will be in such a speculative bubble by that point that even as a much smaller player, there'll be the much smaller player with the network to keep working. I suppose there's two other things I think that are really important coming up with this. One, it's only a few years now before the Swiss, the Germans, the French, there'll be the three big players initially, can move to basically robotic production on most goods. So quality 24 hours a day, where the only humans in the factory maintain the machines. Mm-hmm. So let's forget about AI. That's wishful thinking. How long it is to the singularity. We don't care about the singularity. We care if they can make our iPhone cheaper and more perfect.
Right.
And the reality is, the French, the Germans, the Japanese to an extent, the Swiss are pretty much on the way to that, in the next 10 years. So for China, they have to transition to that. The only advantage they have when things get worse is they will have the network for moving things and the relationship where people are used to buying Chinese products.
Yeah.
So if we add the extra layer to this, which is now becoming evident, part of the One Belt, One Road is in the main China are trying to introduce new technical standards within the areas where they have influence. So different Wi-Fi standards, different 5G standards, different telecommunication standards. Meaning if you're inside the network, you get cheap stuff from China that arrives on the low-cost train or ship, which you can afford to buy immaterial to the state of your economy.
Can we do a little venture in, because we've touched on it a little bit, into Europe? David, I don't know if you have strong feelings about that particular part of the world, but there are, serious issues with Europe. And
monumental.
I feel like because we haven't had let's call it a GFC-like event. We did really. We had an unraveling. We had the Euro crisis, and we had that. But it was kind of averted, Armageddon. And I say kind of because we know countries like Greece and Spain have suffered immeasurably. What's the path for Europe? Is there a happy path?
Well, let's get to the underlyings of the GFC with them.
Sure.
In the case of the Americans, the taxpayer obviously bailed them out, and everyone knows it. In the case of the Europeans are much quieter about the extent to which they propped up the German and the French banks.
Yeah.
And that there was almost no choice but to break Portugal, Ireland, Greece and Spain in order to keep the German and French banks upright.
Yes, and just to interrupt that, I think that's a very important point.
Yeah.
And I find this personally very upsetting that because the EU is held up and constantly held up usually by its own member states, particularly Germany and France, as being so wonderful. But let's be very clear that the German and French and sort of let's call it Central Europe, they have broken the back of these countries. And what they've done to Greece, I think, is unconscionable. Yeah. And it is only to do one thing, as far as I can see. It's to ensure the balance sheet of their banks. Until they're confident enough that they can handle the type of sort of economic hit to their balance sheet if there was a default. So if you think about the cycle of money, sorry, David, to interrupt here, but if you think about the cycle, the money doesn't go to Greece. These loans, people think they're going to they don't. They get recycled back into the German banks. And the poor Greek people have been suffering immeasurably. And the big worry is that, Europe is going to break up. And I'm like, it should have happened.
Wow.
Okay. What you tell me who's benefiting out of this. And if you come up with the answer, it's the banks, then that's probably not the answer we want. So anyway, that's my rant over it. David, I don't know if you want to chime in.
Yeah, I'll try and add what I can. It might sound ranty too, because again, I see an equally big problem. That the whole idea of the EU was to construct something that held people together to try and avoid another European war.
Exactly.
And what's been made clear is there's the people in the centre who decide if you're broken or not.
Yeah.
Okay, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain are small-ish players with a bit of distance from the centre. But for all the new members to Europe, the Central Europeans, who have much more horrible memories of war and communism, so they've got the double dose of bad memories. What they make of this club they've supposedly joined is anyone's guess. So when you're in a period where Hungary is legitimately talking to Russia about looking east rather than west, that must be the first time in history. When you've got the Poles who are going through the most terrible economic transformation at the moment that no one wants to talk about. The Germans happily exported manufacturing to Poland in the mid-90s. Now, those factories are now all 20 years old. They're not up to date enough to make good products cheap, and the Germans are pulling the production back home into the next generation factories, which will be the first generation to become predominantly robotic. So the Poles have gone from communist to earning minimum wage in a factory but doing better, to having to learn languages to move into the service sector within a generation and a half.
Is that a problem, by the way? Is the fact that if more citizens of those European countries are more multilingual, would that actually make things a bit more unified? Like I often hear that it's and this is a completely kind of cultural issue more so than an economic one, but I often hear that it's the lack of kind of movability between the countries that is forcing them to be in opposition to one another.
We're getting a new version now where we're getting, because everyone knows things are getting hard, and because there are so many more people from the country next door, you're getting more xenophobia. You're going, don't take our job, don't push our house prices up. So, Poles are nowhere near as welcome in the Western EU as they were. And yet if they go home, what are they going home to?
God.
The certain job is gone in under a generation and a half. So if we look at the fact that we have borderline fascism in Hungary, a right wing heading towards fascism in Poland, the left back in power in Spain, but only just and in rejection of a totally incompetent right-wing government, we're going to start getting flicking from further to the left, to further to the right, to further to the left, further to the right, for anyone to have a brave idea. Because what has been shown to be true by the poor handling of economics in the EU is that when push comes to shove, the powerful will just put you under the wheels of the bus. So we're going to get a growth of nationalism again. What was interesting in Europe, and a brilliant guy called John Newhouse wrote about this in the late 90s, is a new identity was brewing, where you could be European at a macro level, but you could be your city or region at a micro level. So you might be someone from Stuttgart who was also a European. The bit that would be least relevant to you was being German.
Yeah.
You could be from Marseille and a European, but French had become less relevant to you. Whereas what we see since the GFC in that 10 years is those micro identities are just as important, because when we're stressed, we go for the smallest thing we understand. But the supranational means nearly nothing to most people now. The importance of the national identities has come back dramatically in Europe. And of course, the cosmopolitan elite who are skimming across the top of the mess, as long as the ice holds up, they're fine. Their cosmopolitan world is still intact. But the ice is getting thinner. And below the ice is now just economic chaos leading to economic pressure, leading to social distinction, leading to a shift towards further left and further right in politics, which will make consensus even harder.
So if you're looking into your crystal ball, does the euro, not the European nation,
Like
the European currency, do we still have it 5 years, 10 years? Does it stay? Is it a bad marriage, but we stay together, or is it a...
I think we'll start getting countries on the periphery opting out when the combination of low-cost Russian energy and low-cost Chinese stuff arriving on trains means the euro is doing you no favours. Little countries are going to go, really, what are we gaining? We could have access to energy now, stuff now. We'll never be treated as an equal, but we're not being treated as an equal anyway.
Right. And not trapped within a system.
Yeah.
It's sort of under boot. Okay. Well, that's very interesting. I think it's really underestimated. On the global stage, Europe is incredibly underestimated from a risk. If there was a tail risk out there, that would be one of them. The other thing that's happening at the moment, and this is actually David mentioned this, the Bretton Woods Agreement, lots to it, but one of the parts of it that we sort of inherited to this day, and the Americans inherited, and I say they inherited, but they inherited from their own government because they pushed for it. That was for the US to be central to the trading system. So they were sort of the buyer of last resort. And also they soaked up the global capital. What we're seeing now is Trump trying to move us away from that. And I was predicting this quite some time ago. I wasn't predicting Trump, but I was predicting the US will either want to or have to move itself away from the central global trade. So I took two questions for you, David. What do you see as this path? Do you see that as likely? And is Trump a cause or a symptom of that direction?
I think it's easier to start with the second one, because that way we get to the systemic issues. He is a symptom.
Yeah.
He is a symptom of the fact that the US has been in this position where they've been spending other people's money to have a very nice life, but to not invest in the future. The only thing they've invested in the future in is the military. So, when all you've invested in is your military, you treat everything like a military problem. And that's what we've seen post 9/11. Immaterial of the problem, send the military until they're basically the last respected bit of the US system. So, Trump is a direct symptom of a system that refused to take action when it could have. If we want to look for a really critical moment in American history that I think gets totally underestimated, it was Jimmy Carter's speech to the US population when he was president about what kind of America they wanted to live in. Did they want to be a greedy country that just, used stuff up? Or did they want to make a country they could be proud of and a world they'd like to live in? And, some people would argue, okay, it was the big obvious things, like the US embassy siege in Iran that lost him the presidency. But if you actually look at what gave the Republicans the most power against Carter, it was Carter getting Americans to question what they were and what their future would be. And Reagan was able to throw at him, "You're not patriotic." which is the kiss of death in America.
This is what Jordan Peterson often talks about.
Yeah.
It's this pull back to this ebb and flow, and the pull back to the sort of that tradition, that conservative side. And Jimmy Carter really, you're absolutely right there. Interesting, he's 94 years old, still alive, and he still he walks the talk. He does he still builds for the community. So
he's a hero to more people than he ever was as president. And I think the sort of critical flow on of all of this is that because neoliberalism and neoconservatism settled first and most effectively in the United States, became orthodox if you did an economics degree, orthodox in a commerce degree, orthodox in a political science degree. Because the US was the first place where orthodoxy happened for neoconservatism and neoliberalism, there's a delusion somewhere in America that they were successful because they were smart and their policies were good. They forget that they were meant to be the place the money flowed to from the world as a safe place to hold and invest the money to help the whole world. So the Americans confuse the profits that came to them and their own behaviour. They think their own behaviour created the profits. The profits largely came from Germany and Japan being set up as bulwarks against communism. The profits came from rebuilding South Korea to annoy China. The profits were not because America was particularly good at economic policy. It comes from the fact that at the end of World War II, a system was created that was meant to funnel money back to the global policemen so they could afford to help make a better world.
There's a good article out recently from an economist whose name escapes me, but it was very similar, talking about that. The global economy is essentially a war economy.
Well, that's what I'm picking up from this conversation, is that the traditional war is like not...
It's basically we're in perpetual war, and that's the point of the economy. I'm not a believer in this, by the way. Just to be clear.
Sure, yeah.
I'm not sure I believe it, but no one's presented me with a better answer to explain how and why America could consistently not do a great job economically, but have money flow to it. So someone's got to explain how, when you annoy so many countries and you make products countries can't afford, that money still flows to you.
Well, I mean, that is the system, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, whether you believe it or not. But and I think the future holds something different.
Absolutely.
It made sense when the United States was 50 plus 55, I think, or more % of the global economy. Today it's not. It's a quarter. I don't know exact numbers, but it can't do it anymore.
No.
It's not. It can't. So the world's, it's got to change. And what worries me, so I think, I've been kind of navigating this a little bit, but what worries me, because we're talking about China, we've got issues in China. Europe is the sort of underestimated basket case, and we've got really a US withdrawal from the center of the global stage in a not a necessarily smooth fashion. But the question, therefore, is who takes that leadership role? And you'll need something. And my worry, well, you don't have to have something. Let's be clear. You can have chaos. And what worries me is that no one's doing it. No one's even recognized the requirement that we need we need Bretton Woods Part 2, is my opinion. But we're not even close to having that conversation. I don't know what you think about that. Bretton Woods number 2, David, do you think we'll get it?
It's certainly what we need, but let's look historically. Napoleon essentially set modern Europe on its path, gave it enough uniformity that even though he lost, it got a century of the Europeans only killing each other on a small scale. Yeah. They were too busy cutting the world to pieces. And when you're busy cutting new resources to pieces, you can do that.
Yeah.
But there are no new resources left.
Yeah.
We know that Afghanistan's got lots of lithium under it. We know Colombia's got lots of lithium under it. We know exactly where everything we need is for the next economy, and it's all under things we can't steal or brutalise our way to. We can brutalise to a degree, but it has to be some sort of deal with a government making use of their own system to help exploit it. So part of the problem is now we used to be able to put off problems by going other places and finding new things to play with, where there's no new things to play with.
Yeah.
So for the first time ever, we actually have to deal with each other and deal with other states and deal with other systems and deal with scarcity being a real thing for the first time. And scarcity being a real thing, I think, is one of the biggest underpinning thoughts that no one wants to accept. Whether you want to buy into climate change or not, whether you want to buy into peak oil or not, you have to be deluded to not acknowledge we now genuinely face scarcity. And with facing scarcity, the nature of economics and politics has to change. But when we've been in essentially a zombie system since World War II, where the system was put in place, it was a no-hand system. It ran until the GFC, but because of the too big to fail argument, we poured all the money that could have made something new into sustaining the zombie system.
Oh, that's for sure. I'd like to wrap it up.
On that somber note.
Well, yeah.
Until next week.
Yeah. But it's been awfully enjoyable to have you on, David. And I was wondering if we possibly could invite you back, because we didn't get even close to some of the subjects I'd like to touch on, which in particular, I know we have a large American audience, but hopefully they might be interested in Australia, because we've managed to traverse the world and we forgot about Australia. And I think, with our revolving political door here of leaders, and again, for our American audience, we have a different system here. We elect a party. The party elects the prime minister, and that's been a revolving door. I think we've had 7 prime ministers, and
I think it's 7 in 11.
7 and 11. 7 and 11.
Yeah.
I mean, it's totally mad. Again, is this causing, or is this a symptom?
No, that's what I was going to say. We'll say at the end, it's another case of a symptom of something far deeper.
So there's something.
And we could start there.
Yeah, and I think we're touching on a lot of things that we're seeing on the surface that are symptoms of something deeper, and I think this is really good to have this conversation.
Definitely. It seems it's very, very important. You've completely changed my view of global geopolitics, for instance, and just from an economic standpoint, it's incredibly complex. So
I think a final thing to kind of add, even though we ended on a pretty dour note, is there is more communication than ever before, more ability to transport people and stuff than ever before. It's easier to move capital than it's ever been before.
Yeah.
Everything is in place to fix all of this.
Right.
Other than a clear plan and will.
Right.
One of the things that keeps me optimistic, by the way, and I think this is a good subject too, to drag in for next time, which is I think we're on the verges of a clean energy disruption, and I'd be super interested, because energy, a lot of people believe energy is at the center of global economic power, and I think that'd be a great area to also touch on.
And perhaps we're even in the midst of what Jordan Peterson would call a Gutenberg revolution of voice, and we've got the 2 very intelligent speakers like yourselves to help everyone make a little bit of heads or tails of what's going on. That is imperative to most democracies. So it's good to have you on. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Tim.
This is Currency Affairs.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.